Welcome to another episode of Sink or Swim, brought to you by Rentsync. From operational challenges to marketing mastery, we uncover the strategies and technologies in all things prop tech. So let's dive in as we explore the trends, tactics, and insights that define the future of multifamily investments. Sink or Swim starts now.
Well, hey guys, I'm Giacomo Lattis, and I'm joined in studio today by two very special guests for a really exciting conversation. One of our guests will be a familiar face if you're watching, or a familiar voice if you're listening. The one and only Max Steinman, CEO of Rentsync and Rentals.ca. Max, thanks for coming to our studio today.
Thanks for having me again.
And there's always strength in numbers, so we were lucky enough to get some time with the Jenna Chick, Director of Leasing at Fitzrovia. Once again, thank you, Jenna, for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So in this episode, we're going to be tackling some of the rental market's hottest takes. I'm going to read them out, and I'd love both of you guys just to give your opinions on them, whether they're truth, myth, in a polite, cordial way. We want a nice conversation here. I know we got hot takes. It gets in the weeds a little bit, but nice open conversation, whether there's truth or myth to any of these hot takes. I'm going to start off with one that I still hear today as a renter from my family. I'm sure everyone has heard it at some point, but the first one is renting is just a waste of money. What do we think about that? Is some truth to that or mostly myth?
Well, first off, we promise to behave on all these hot takes. But yeah, why don't we start with you, Jenna? Like you're in the business of talking to renters like every single day with your team. And I'm sure you hear this a decent amount, like, or people under their breath, saying this sort of thing. So
yeah, we hear it all the time. It's no secret that affordability in Toronto in terms of home ownership has skyrocketed. I also think there's this stigma of like, you grow up, you graduate, you buy a house, you get married and all of those things. That's just not what it is. Today, I had a colleague who's from New York, and it was when she told me nobody in New York buys. Everyone in New York is renting, that it really resonated that that's just what you do in a big metropolitan, in a big city. And so you have options to go and buy, but renting is a really great option. It's very consistent, cash out the door. You know what your monthly payments are going to be month over month. It gives you flexibility to move, whether it's another neighborhood in the city or if you think that your job might take you away. We hear it all the time. And I just think it is a myth. Yeah. For the right person, renting is a really, really, really great option.
I think it's a reality as well that just for some people in our current macroeconomic environment, that it's just not a reality that home ownership is on the table for many people right now, right? So Canada's home ownership rates have actually been on the decline now for about 4 or 5 years, and they were very, very high. So they almost had room to kind of regress back to the mean of other G20 countries. So we're seeing that, but so that means on the inverse, rentership rates are on the increase. And I think it's just a reality that more people need to rent right now based on the economy.
There's kind of a stigma though too, isn't there? Like maybe North America or even Canada specifically, that like renting is somehow like lesser than home ownership. But I find that that's not actually the case around the world, right? Some places, like you mentioned there, I'm only going to rent, right? But I feel like there is that stigma still in Canada and probably in the States too.
We're seeing it more often now that people do have the choice between buying or renting, and people are opting to rent. They don't want to deal with the maintenance of a property. They want to be able to lock their door and maybe go down to a winter house or a summer cottage. And it's easy. Yeah. Maintenance is taken care of. They're not worried about any of those things that do come with home ownership, any of the other financial burdens. And it is nice to see that people have a choice and are making the choice to rent and kind of reducing that stigma. We'll say it's definitely still prevalent here in Toronto, but we are about 10 to 15 years behind some other major markets where renting is more prevalent.
I'd say absolutely, especially on the maintenance side, and especially with, Toronto in particular, our housing stock is really old. These are homes that need a lot of maintenance. I just got hit with some brutal bills, to be honest. I had to re-side the entire back of my house, and I in doing that was told I also need a new roof, and we're talking like $30,000 of unplanned expense, right? So that's one of those benefits. You're a renter, you don't even have to consider that sort of stress whatsoever. I think also on the stigma point, great point. We have sort of a shift occurring in Canada in particular, where the idea of an apartment building is changing. We all kind of grew up in this generation where everyone in Toronto and Vancouver in particular, but Canada, thought of condos as rentals. And I mean, Fitzrovia is the perfect example of sort of redefining the entire space where rental building, where the whole building is a rental, is now becoming very commonplace. And it's totally changing the way that, renters think about new multi-residential properties. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
You said it, redefining rental living. So it's not going up into your apartment and leaving for the day. We are putting in a ton of resort style amenities, creating community, creating bonds with your neighbors. Every time we tour people through the building, it doesn't get old for me of just the sheer shock that a product like that exists in the market. And it's really, really expanding. So you're starting to see a lot of purpose-built rental buildings coming up in Canada that just didn't exist before, kind of carving out this different node aside from the older 60s, 70s style rental buildings where not amenitized. You might have some staff that works at the building, but more working remote or split across a ton of different buildings where they're dedicated. They're there for you. The concierge team knows you by name. You have your property management team, your maintenance team. Back to that maintenance point, anything goes wrong, looking to address it within 24 hours. And so just that really luxe style of living.
I think now when you look up, let's say you're just driving down the Gardiner, which is really slow these days.
Yes.
As we know.
Or just like anywhere where you have a vantage point of the city, if you're flying into the city, flying out of the city, or any Canadian city, not just Toronto, and you see all these cranes in the sky, like in the past, you would have said, oh, look at all those condo buildings going up, right? And that's just the way Canadians thought. So there's a bit of re-education. Now, near 50% of all of those cranes across Canada are rental cranes. So we hope that people start, I think that the market is sort of being re-educated towards that concept.
I think so. And hopefully this podcast will help. Let's go to another hot take here that at Rentals.ca, as you know, we post our rent reports and gets a lot of media coverage. And with that comes a lot of conversation that starts from a lot of times renters. And we get this hot take all the time, which I'd love your opinion on, is that landlords are only interested in profits. Because what we keep hearing is that the landlords are on one side, renters are on the other. They're just asking for as much money as possible and that they're only interested in profits, not necessarily having the right person find the right apartment. So I'm kind of curious about that hot take because we get asked that quite a bit from, I guess you could understand, some renters who are seeing the prices right now. Yeah,
I think when you look at condo stock and you have those individual landlords that maybe bought one or two or a couple units, or they might be a foreign investor, they're looking to cover their costs. So if their costs are going up, rents are also going up. For us at Fitzrovia, community is really at the core of what we do in our product. And I kind of touched on it with the last hot take, but we do a lot of different resident events and programming and really creating communities within our building. Of course, there's costs that need to be covered. And with rising costs, you do see an increase in rent, but that is not the first and foremost priority. We want our residents to be comfortable. We want them to love where they live, be proud of where they live, and have all of the amenities, all of the community. It's nice to see, neighbors chatting with one another. We have a lot of international residents making friends, and it might be their first time in Canada and they really do feel at home. So creating that sense of community is something we're really proud of.
Fitzrovia does an incredible job of that. They, really focus on creating sense of community and lifestyle. And that really comes through, in it's a real thing. Like it is a real thing. I think of when I hear that hot take, at the end of the day, it's also important to remember that nobody builds rental housing or buys rental housing to lose money. Just nobody does that. Sure. That's just not the way that we've set up North American society, right? It's a capitalistic society, and we do have to remember that. And I think it's important to remember that for those rental housing providers, if there isn't an opportunity to make a fair return at the end of the day, they'll take that capital that would have gone into building or buying rental housing and they'll bring it elsewhere, right? So I don't think that there's truth in that all they care about is profit. If all you care about is profit in any business setting, you're likely not to have very much profit, of course. Like, you need a great product with a great value proposition that drives demand. And then obviously profit comes with that. And that profit incentive is what gets a Fitzrovia, as an example, or any other company out there or investor to say, let's do another one of those projects. Let's do another, which fills the market with housing supply, which at the end of the day is really important to society, to renters, so that they can actually afford to rent. If we don't have more supply, we're in big trouble in this country, as we know. So,
but also too, like, what people think of as a landlord, you know, there's a lot of small business owners who maybe they only own a couple units, right? And like, the rental properties are their income, right? So I think there's also adds a little bit too, where I think people just see landlords, I should say, as this big conglomerates, but a lot of the times too, they're just everyday people who have a few units. And yeah, obviously they need some profit, and their costs have also gone up quite a bit too with everything going on, right? So I think what a landlord is a lot of different things to a lot of different people as well. And I think that's important to get across too.
Yeah, it's not a one size fits all title for sure.
Okay, well, we know vacancy rates right now in Canada aren't the best. I believe we're like 1.5% national vacancy rate as we stand now, with some of Canada's biggest cities below 1%. So I get why this hot take is said a lot. It's impossible to find a good rental. Vacancy rates are low. I get this right now, but is there truth to that? Is it not as truthful? What do we think about that one?
Look, I think it's definitely more difficult than it has been in the past. But the good news is that there are a ton of new rental buildings being brought to market right now. Actually, basically the most in the last 30 or 40 years now are coming to market. So, you know, if you know where to look, which is online, you can look through many of the marketplaces like Rentals.ca. You know, you'd be pleasantly surprised when there's essentially a lot more rental stock there than I think people understand. It is generally on the higher end of the market. That's the one thing I'll say as a caveat. And that also kind of boils down to the fact that right now it doesn't pencil very well for developers to build, you know, lower end or middle class housing. So those are the more kind of rare assets that can be tougher to find. But still, there's still good turnover and there's still availability. I mean, you just have to, you know, work hard to find it. Yeah.
I also think there's a lot more platforms to utilize now to understand who's renting it, where's the building, the legitimacy of the listing. 10, 15 years ago were the days of Craigslist or Kijiji, and you weren't sure, is this real? Is it a scam? Who am I meeting with? And so as a renter, being confident that they know this listing is legitimate, they know who they're speaking to, where it is, and having developers that do have purpose-built rental buildings where they can go to the websites, explore, see the collateral, the videos, the photos, the floor plans, and make sure that they're confident in the decision before they actually go in to meet them for a tour.
I think that's actually an excellent point. Like, there's a lot of nervous energy out there at the beginning of a rental process for anyone. And because of the way that, you know, Toronto, as an example, or Vancouver has kind of shaped up its rental market in the last 30 years, where you have a lot of these smaller individual landlords who own individual condo units, like the opportunity for being scammed is like super high. And unfortunately it happens a lot. And B, you know, not knowing if, okay, we decide to move into this new condo unit, how stable that will be, right? Like what level of professionality you're going to get potentially out of that landlord, or if you're going to be like rent evicted at some point, or if you're going to be moved out for personal use of the unit. That's actually one of the really nice benefits of purpose-built rentals, is just the set of laws around them are completely different in the Tenancy Act. And so I don't know if you want to speak to that, but like it's a big benefit, right?
Yeah. I think just the long-term nature, we had a lot of people that come to us that say, I've been burned in the past. I paid a deposit. The landlord was nowhere to be found, or, you know, they're moving back in, or they're moving their family into the unit. And now it's a quick turnaround for me to find something new. And so we do hear that often. And it is nice to be able to say, rest assured, it's a long-term hold. The building's not going anywhere. You move in and it's yours. So
The other thing there that is interesting in terms of finding a rental unit or a new place to live that's trending right now is just moving from out of a city into another city. Like we're seeing the most interprovincial migration on record from Ontario to Alberta. And that's not me telling people to move from Ontario to Alberta by any means, but it's happening. So with like the shifting job market and the ability for many people to work from home and have that flexibility, that also opens up, considerably more options. Like people are coming to Rentals.ca as an example, with kind of like a blank slate mindset where they just go like, where is a place I can live where I have a pretty good lifestyle based on affordability? And that's very different versus like the original way of thinking, like location. Now a lot of people, still a ton of people are coming location, but a lot of people are coming affordability. And that's sort of the first mindset. And if you're in that position today, you're in a way better position to actually like, move somewhere else than perhaps in the past where like you had to bring that, you had to have an employer there. You had to, be able to bring that income level that you're at wherever you're going. So that's also kind of a shift that I think is helpful. That's something that's good for renters at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think there's just some like generic tips too. It's like, the summer rental season's really busy. Maybe you can look in the off season, right? Maybe you can get a credit check already done. Maybe you can get your references in order so that even though vacancy rates are low, maybe there's some things that you can do that when something does come available, you're just a little bit more prepared and ready to take ownership of it, right? I think that's kind of the thing as well. It's, are you just going in blind, right? You know that if you're looking, look and make sure you get everything put together so it's a little bit faster. And I think, as you mentioned as well, like I think Calgary, for example, it's like $500 to $600 less than the national average right now on rent, which is around $2,200 for one bedroom. So I could save $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year if I could maybe move to Calgary, great city, work from home. There's so many options of where do you want to live as well. There might not be a good rental in downtown Toronto at a price you're looking for, but are you willing to move to Mississauga, Scarborough? Like there's a whole bunch of options too. So I think we touched on that pretty good, but I think having things aligned before you go into that rental, I think is important. And I mean, you guys probably speak a little bit, especially yourself, Jenna, about like what you want from a possible tenant as opposed to applying for a building. Like I'm sure there's credit checks and references that go through it, but maybe any couple tips that they can do to kind of get started and maybe beat the line up a little bit.
Yeah. So speed to execution is huge on this one, especially in buildings where, a studio suite comes up and there's 3 people that are applying to it. If you have all your documents ready to go, you're paying your last month's rent deposit immediately, you're securing the suite. So things like making sure that you have a solid credit score, you have a letter of employment, you have 2 or 3 recent pay stubs. Mm-hmm. And if you're a student, you have that guarantor lined up. Or if you're not a Canadian resident, that you do have someone who is a Canadian resident as a guarantor and they have all of their documents. I'd say the longest part of the application process is more on the resident or on the prospect and them gathering all of their documents. Yeah. If you're able to do that before, as soon as you see a place that you love and you can envision yourself living there, starting that application and submitting them, we see the turnaround time approved in the same day and people moving in as soon as the following day.
Mm-hmm. I bet that's super important, especially in like a new building in a lease up where there's more competition over some, call it more coveted unit layouts. Mm-hmm. And it could be a matter of a day or 2 days between whether you get like your first choice or your second choice. Do you see that at all?
All the time. I'll use our property at College in Spadina, the Waverley, which is located very close to University of Toronto, very high student population. As soon as a unit hits the market, we have a wait list of people that are looking for it. And so we really emphasize get everything in order now, even if that suite isn't available online or we don't have one, because as soon as it is, we'll let you know. And it's kind of that first person in to submit all of that.
Well, those are great tips. And I think it kind of slides nicely into the next hot take, which we see this all the time in the comments section. We're just getting right into this. Rent prices are arbitrary. That comes across all the time. It's like, oh, these rent increases, they're just made up. It's whatever they want to make. I I have opinions on that, but I'm sure you guys both do as well. Who wants to go first on that one?
Yeah, I think, again, it's important to understand that the ability to make a fair return is important in this business as well as any other business. And without that ability, what will happen is there just won't be as much competition. There won't be as many entrants into that market. And then you actually end up with the reverse of what everybody wants, which is what we're sort of experiencing a little bit right now, which is an affordability crisis. So rent prices typically are actually dictated by what the market can bear. I mean, in general, but like they're there to ultimately provide the landlords, builders, property managers with the fair return that they ultimately need in order to provide that housing and to do it at an investment return that makes sense compared to, say, other investments. Like, it has to be better, as an example, than leaving your money in the bank with Wealthsimple earning 5%.
Yes.
Because it's a lot easier to leave your money in the bank with Wealthsimple earning 5%. They didn't pay us to say anything about their awesome checking account.
But we're open to
rate.
Sponsorships.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, if that's all you're getting, then why would you take on all of the risk associated with either building or buying a rental property and operating a rental property? There's a lot of risk. It's not easy, as I'm sure you can attest to.
There's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of costs that go into maintaining the property, capital work on an older property, all of the resident events and programming we do, that doesn't come at $0. And so, to Max's point, at the end of the day, it is a business. We're obligated to our investment partners to provide them with a return so that we can continue to do what we're doing. With that being said, we're constantly looking at the market, understanding where the market's priced, what is fair on renewal rates for non-rent controlled buildings, ensuring that those are fair. We don't want people leaving our communities. We want to ensure that we're keeping residents in our buildings and our buildings full and whatnot. But also, at the end of the day, rents are increasing. And so we're also going to kind of follow suit with that trend.
And there's a reason, like, there's so many factors why a rental in Toronto is more expensive than Winnipeg, right? It's not just because, there's the costs to build in certain cities are much, much higher than somewhere else, right? The land use divisions take longer sometimes, right? There's much more taxes in certain areas. Like, there's reasons why that's the case. And I think that's why the solution is to not only build purposeful rentals, but more affordable costs. Hence why they removed HST to try to bring that down for developers. But it's just more expensive to build in certain areas of the country than others. And it's a much slower process as well. So that's time as well. That's, there's a lot of factors into it.
And I think it's really important too for us to educate on the value of what you're getting. Yes. And so, a 1-bedroom that's $2,800 a month, when you read that on paper, might sound like a lot of money, but you're getting a full 2-story commercial grade gym. You can now eliminate your gym membership at Equinox. It's $200. Your Rogers Wi-Fi is included, so strip out another $100. You have access to the Cleveland Clinic, so virtual healthcare. You're not having to go to the walk-in clinic or, pay for any of those virtual healthcare platforms. That's an additional cost. And when you kind of do this cost plus analysis and whittle that number down, it actually makes sense. And it's on us to educate the renter on that, get them comfortable around that.
I love that. Like, these are the prices of rent right now, but we're actually giving you more. We know it's expensive. That is why there's a bowling alley. There's educating the renter, I think, is a huge part, and why we're doing this podcast, right? There's so much that we'd like them to have when they're about to get into that rental journey, just of knowledge of the industry and what they're getting into. So, yeah, I mean, the other aspect is, and you mentioned some of these other cities, you used Winnipeg as an example, like the biggest cost is land. Like it's the biggest cost, right? And I think it's sometimes gets forgotten in the whole picture that, the value component as well is location, which isn't just the city itself, but goes right down to very specific neighborhoods and the types of amenities beyond the building that are, within those neighborhoods. And, Toronto is a world-class city, right? Like Vancouver is a world-class city. And that's no shade at Winnipeg. It's an amazing place too. And I've spent like a good amount of time there, but you can't fly from Winnipeg
to Munich direct, right? Like you can fly from Toronto or Vancouver all over the world direct. It's massive international business hubs, like unbelievable fine dining experiences,
Yeah, for sure.
entertainment.
Vancouver's beautiful.
Major sports leagues.
Yeah.
Like so is Winnipeg though. Like
Sure.
not to take
We love
away.
Winnipeg.
We literally
Just to
love
be
Winnipeg.
clear.
Everyone said we love Winnipeg.
Yeah. But that's the biggest factor as well, right?
Yeah.
Like and those things balance out too, and that's what's actually happening right now. Like that you've got a ceiling just based on sort of wage growth too in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where people are making that calculation in their head and they're going, okay, I can't live as strong of a lifestyle here now. So some people are making the decision to move to different cities.
Right.
And as they move to those cities become more populated. And some of those people are entrepreneurs and restaurateurs, and they open different restaurants or small businesses, and those cities grow and move even closer and balance sort of out to some of the major metros in Canada. So it's all just kind of there's just a flow to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So, yeah.
So this next one, I've been speaking with a lot of journalists and the media out in British Columbia lately, because there's been a lot of legislation happening about Airbnbs and Verbos. And I spent a lot of time talking about this, and I'd love a second opinion on this as well from you both. Short-term rentals are ruining the housing market. There's tons of new, I'm sure we've talked about it personally, just all the new legislations happening right now. Is that true? How does short-term rentals play a factor in all of this? Because there seems to really be a lot of new legislation happening to maybe curb some of this. So again, cordial conversation, but let's get at it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that's more of a symptom, not the cause, unfortunately. The cause in terms of unaffordability has been a lack of supply in the market. And I guess, a symptom, well, not that it's not playing a factor, because you've got quite a few short-term rentals in major metros across Canada that I think are perceived to be taking up what could be long-term rental supply. Mm-hmm. But there's like consequences to everything, right? So everybody in Canada does some form of travel and stays in hotels across the country. And those short-term rentals are extremely important part of our hospitality sector. So you strip them out, and guess what? Marriott stock is doing pretty well these days, exactly. Right? And so, for every action, there's a reaction. I think, they've got a bad rap, particularly because of, let's say, in the condo market, where there's just what they kind of call like ghost hotels in downtown Toronto and Vancouver. And those are really seen as, entire floors that are basically like Airbnb or short-term rentals, and could be long-term. So I think they might be a mechanism to help in call it the short term for, alleviating supply. But at the end of the day, we just need to build more long-term rental housing. Like that's just it. The only other thing I'll make a point of there is the reason why a landlord who maybe owns a condo in downtown Toronto decides, I'm going to make this an Airbnb rather than I'm just going to, post to Rentals.ca and find a long-term renter, is also because of their fear of the rental regulations in a market like Ontario. I know British Columbia is the same, where under the tenancy agreement and with the state of the landlord-tenant board, it's extremely scary to be a small landlord.
Yeah.
Think of potentially getting a tenant who decides not to pay their rent. And we've seen processes take like a year before that small landlord can evict a tenant in that situation. And that small landlord could be me or you, or it could be anyone who's invested in that condo, and they can get seriously hurt by that. So they decide to go with short-term rentals often because of that fear. I think if you address that fear and you create fairer systems for landlords to deal with unfair situations, naturally a lot of people would probably not actually want to deal with short-term rentals. They're a serious pain in the ass.
Sure.
For like just a slightly better return, sometimes not even a better return, but like you're talking about people moving in and out on a weekly or daily basis, partying.
Never mind the
messing up their
seasonality of
stuff.
it too,
Like, the
right?
maintenance is so much higher on a short-term rental. Complaints from neighbors, it's crazy. So
Yeah, your overall wear and tear has just gone through the roof, which will then increase your costs. It's a really good point about the landlord tenant board. If you get a tenant into a unit and they stop paying, your arrears are just piling up until you actually are able to be seen by a judge. And then to actually get the eviction order is another set of time, and then actually getting them out of the unit. At that point, for an individual landlord, it could be like a make or break case for them. For us, we don't do any short-term rentals, so we're 12 months and above. We see a lot of people who are moving to Toronto, again, international city, international hub for work. Maybe they're renovating their home and they need a stopgap solution for a couple of months, insurance claims. And so there are groups out there that do operate more professional or corporate short-term rentals in combination with Airbnb. So I think there's a place for them in the market. It's not a business that we're going to get into, but bringing people to the city, new immigration, having them set up somewhere for maybe 3 months before they go on to find their permanent longer term housing solution.
it's a great point, especially with our influx of immigration. Like, newcomers often first start with like a 3-month rental while they get all of their affairs in order, right? So in the end, like, again, every action, there's reaction. Sure. So you're going to hurt the hospitality industry, which supports, by the way, like probably a ton of renters yes. who work in that industry, right? So if you make it harder to travel to Canada, you make it harder to travel to Toronto because everything's more expensive and there's no short-term rentals and you're having to, check into 5-star Marriott's, like that comes out in the wash.
Yeah. And I think it's important to hammer home that like the crisis that we're in right now is the lack of supply of purpose-built rentals. An influx of 5,000 Airbnbs into the market is not, it's not moving the needle. It's enough. Not doing anything. We need a mass scale, right? I think the CMHC said, 3 million homes by 2030, which good luck to that. But like, that's what we're talking about here, right? So taking someone's Airbnb, I'm sure that they've worked hard to have a second source of income, right? I don't know what that's actually doing in the long term, besides kind of limiting people who want to have another source of income, who've worked hard for it. So it's kind of a muddy situation. I think that's what most people actually kind of have fallen on. They kind of agree that people should be allowed to, if they've saved up enough money, buy another property and use it how they want because they've worked hard to do it, right? And I think when you kind of start limiting that, there's a lot of ramifications that could come. We don't have to get into them, but there's a domino effect, I think, with all of this. And maybe that's too hot of a take, but
too hot. No.
Never too hot.
Now this one's spicy. We'll see how long we can go for this one. I know this is near and dear to Max's heart, so we'll give you the next 3 hours to talk about this one. But rent control.
You go first. No, you go.
Rent control is the solution to housing affordability. Some truth, some myth, all truth. What do we think?
We were chatting about this before, and I think we're aligned on this one, that rent control helps in the near term. In the long term, it can be detrimental for buildings. So again, when you're not able to have your rents increase at the same rate as your costs, you're creating a deficit. The landlord's then not able to put the money back into the building that they need to maintain it and keep it in a well-operating state. We've started to acquire older purpose-built rental stock in Toronto and Montreal, and some of the states of the buildings have been really challenging.
It's old. They're old.
They're
right?
old. They need a lot of TLC, beyond TLC, full gut renovation. And the overwhelming feedback from the residents who lived there before and after is, thank you for coming in and fixing these problems. And what it comes down to is there aren't the finances there to go and do it. Mm-hmm. And then these renters are left with no choice but to stay in this building because their rent is so far off of what the current market rent is in Toronto. And so it really does pose this challenge. And yeah, I don't know if you want to continue on, but...
No, it's bang on. I mean, to me, rent controls, and I kind of use it plural because there's many different types in different markets and different sort of levels. But in general, rent controls and regulations that use rent controls, they basically disrupt the natural business to consumer, call it philosophy, that just should exist in any business to consumer market. And what I mean by that is like, okay, take any business outside of our industry. What should happen is the business offers a service or a product, and with that, they're generally striving to offer good customer service and a good experience. Right. And the customer ultimately makes the decision: A, do I want to buy in the first place, whatever this product or service is? B, do I want to, once they do buy, if they do buy, continue this relationship and buy more products or continue to subscribe or whatever it is? We make that decision around Netflix. We make that decision around Amazon. If, I'm sure a lot of people out there have, subscribed to, a service and at the beginning they loved it. And then, somewhere along the line, they said, I'm not really seeing the value anymore. And they just, shut it down. Right. And I think that doesn't happen in rent control environments, which really is disruptive. It creates a lot of negative consequences. And that's where you see what's so particular about our industry is this divide that is created, and it's a real divide between tenants and landlords, tenant groups and landlord associations. And the reason that divide exists is because that natural business to consumer ideology is totally disrupted. Like, it's not always in the best interest of a landlord who's in a rent controlled environment to continue to provide the best possible customer service and experience to that end user, because there could be a greater incentive for them actually not to. That's really bad. So it's basically created this like horrible divide.
Because if you move out, I can now increase the rent to what it should already be, right?
Correct.
So you could double it. You could put it on the market at whatever price you decided you wanted to, effectively.
Yeah. The other thing that's like, I feel basically unfair, and you hear like the federal government right now is always talking about tax fairness, and there's this kind of concept going on as we have like a wealth gap divide happening in the country where we're all talking about fairness again. But you have buildings in the city of Toronto, which is, it's probably in Toronto, is probably the worst case in the country. Also Vancouver, just because rents have gone so high, where, you'll have two tenants in a building, next door neighbors on the same floor with basically the same unit, paying drastically different rates. Like you've said in your, newer assets that were purchased, that what was the differences in rent?
See, if you've been in a building for 30 years, think back to what rents were for a 1-bedroom 30 years ago versus somebody who moved in last year. It's hundreds, thousands of dollars of a gap.
So you basically have existing tenants, sometimes we'll call them legacy tenants, and no shade at these people. They're just following the rules, right? I'm not expecting them to say, raise my rent even more. No one would do that. No rational person. But you have these existing tenants ultimately subsidizing new renters. And that's what's happening. And who's hurt the most? New renters, newcomers to Canada, people graduating from university and looking for their first new rental and to start their life. These people are impacted. People who have to move for jobs, they're impacted way more than, people who have lived in buildings for a long time. And so that also creates a divide, right? Like that's, the whole thing is quite divisive at the end of the day. And again, this isn't to say that we don't empathize with renters. There's a huge affordability issue out there.
Sure.
But, it's rent control is a sort of patch. It can make a renter's life much better for a short period of time. It will benefit those who are already in rental units, but over the long haul, it's going to limit supply in all markets. And that's just the truth. I mean, every economic study that's ever looked at rent controlled markets, it's always less affordable than unrent controlled markets. Take Alberta, where everyone is moving right now. There's no rent control. There's no rent control in Saskatchewan. A lot of interprovincial migration there. Rents are way lower, right? So it limits supply, it creates a divide between landlords and tenants, and it basically creates an unfair burden on new renters. And so we have to think, is that like what we want in the long term? Or do we just want to focus on creating supply so that things become more affordable long term?
Yeah, like I do understand it, like, because I'm a renter, and the last few years, especially with COVID, like we've seen exponential increases in pretty much everything, gas, groceries, all the bills, right? Everything's gone up. But, you know, selfishly, maybe not even selfishly, it's kind of comforting to know that, hey, my rent's going to only go up 2% a year. At least I know that is going to be the same. But on the flip side, I know I can't move out because my rent's at such a good price that I got pre-COVID, right? I think, and is that kind of what you're getting into with like how it limits supply because there's typically less turnover, you think? Because when you...
Kind of. I mean, yes, when there's less turnover, there's less like choice generally in the market. Mm-hmm. So that's also not great. Like it creates stress in the market, and it tends to also increase prices. But more so, look, you can't, I mean, some have suggested this, but you can't say to a grocer who's thinking about opening up a new grocery store in Toronto, hey, listen, you can only ever sell tomatoes for $2 a pound. How much is a tomato? I don't know. $2?
I don't eat vegetables.
$3? Yeah, exactly. I can't afford vegetables.
We don't eat vegetables.
Point is, you can't set a price and then just say, regardless of everything that happens in the macro, when you grow those tomatoes, when you import those tomatoes, whatever, we're gonna let you know how much you can increase the price of those tomatoes. Like, no one would open a grocery store, is my point. And that's the problem. There will not be enough capital that flows into this space to promote the development of new housing, any type of new housing, but specifically and especially purpose-built rentals when you have rent controls. You're basically just limiting the investment, not even upside, but just the potential of that investment. And that's kind of where we found ourselves now. And like, look at cities like New York, rent control, right? Like, look at cities like Toronto, rent control, cities like Vancouver, rent control. Sorry, these are the province that obviously dictates that, but these are not affordable places.
Yeah.
And I think on the flip side, so any building in the last 7 or 8 years that is not rent controlled, which are any of our newly constructed assets, making sure that we're very thoughtful and fair around what those rent increases are. So, you know, you'll hear horror stories of, I got hit with a 20% rent increase. You know, that's not fair either. So being very thoughtful around that, but having that control, I think, in determining what that percentage is, as dictated by a landlord's rising costs as well, is where you kind of find yourself in a fair, neutral position.
I find a lot of those horror stories that they tend to get a lot of PR because, you know, they're kind of, I don't know, what's the word? They're just like
juicy.
They're juicy. Yeah. They're headline
they
grabbers.
Viral.
Yeah. They're headline grabbers. Like a lot of the time
clickbait.
It's in clickbait. That's what I was looking for. They're the individual landlord. And that's, again, I'm not demonizing individual landlords. 90% of them are great, but you know, there's bad actors out there. Mm-hmm. And then it just takes one landlord with maybe 2 condos or 1 condo to create sort of a headline grabber for the entire industry that paints this negative brush. But it's just one other reason why purpose-built rentals are so necessary. And because you get these professionally managed buildings where their goal is not to end up in the headlines. I guarantee you, unless it's for something really cool that you guys
something
are doing.
Something cool and fun and positive for sure. But otherwise, like, we're not interested. We want to stay out of that. An individual landlord is looking at that unit and the increase for that unit, whereas we're looking at the asset as a whole. And so it's not the individual unit 201, unit 202, 203, et cetera, but the building itself. And so you have a little bit more flexibility to be fair in that sense.
Or even that individual landlord may be hoping you move out. Not necessarily because you're like a bad tenant, but they have some other idea for the property, right? Like maybe they want their niece or nephew to move in, right? So it's like, let's just hit them with a brutal increase and maybe they'll just move out. I don't have to go through an entire process, landlord tenant board. It could take a year. And that's like, I'm not saying that that's like acceptable behavior necessarily. I'm just saying like these are the types of like vulnerabilities that you can find yourself in if you're a tenant for a one-off small landlord who owns a condo in downtown Toronto. That's, you know,
that's the thing, the small landlord, right? Like you were mentioning your housing costs recently, right? You know, if you're like small landlords who have 1 or 2 units, right? What are their property taxes have gone in the last few years, right? If they need to do some upkeep, you know, need a new roof, like new anything like that, right? It's not just the big conglomerates, it's small landlords are affected by this too. And I think if you keep that in mind, and I think most landlords in Canada are small to medium-sized landlords. Like there's
most, it's like 70% are actually like 1 to 10 units, which is like why we almost have to grow the other side of it, like the professionally managed, because it's a safer environment for tenants at the end of the day. It's safer in a few different senses of the word. Like how often, I'm curious, how often is that in your pitch and your leasing agent's pitch? And then like how often do residents or prospective residents like already know that, or are you giving them like new information like, wow, I never considered that as a benefit, that like renting from, you know, a professionally managed purpose-built rental is going to benefit me A, B, C in terms of like security? And
it's a combination. So for those who are international and have moved here, maybe lived in a Chicago or New York or city where purpose-built rental is there and prevalent, they already understand. And so when they are coming to move to Toronto, they're looking for those buildings because they've had past experience. They know what they're about. They can rest assured that they'll be taken care of. But there for sure is an education component just because the market segment here is so small. And so we're really having to advocate for purpose-built rentals, for property management companies. You're not dealing with an individual landlord. We're on site. There's faces to names. It's not just an email that you're going to hear back, you know, a week or 2 later. So there is that education component still, although I'd say less this year than last. Yeah, which is nice to see.
And then on the flip side, sorry, I'm taking question master. Are you okay with that right now?
Man, I need to break from these spicy takes.
Yeah. On the flip side, how often does it potentially work against you guys? You're touring some prospective residents that the property's not rent controlled on your new purpose-built rentals, and how often does a resident actually like clue in on that and go, oh, like you could raise my rent any amount next year, whereas like if I move into the building across the street, which was built in 1990, you know, I'm safe, you know? Like how often does that come
We get
up?
it a lot more often now and a lot earlier in the process. Things that people just didn't think about before, i.e. rent control, they're asking upfront even before they come into tour. What we've started to do is looking at maybe a longer term lease, so 24 months, and pre-negotiating what that renewal increase is so they can get comfortable around it. They are confident in their financial ability to plan for what that increase might be. And that's giving people a lot of sense of security and has been really well taken up by the market for sure. But it most definitely is coming up much more frequently now. There's a lot more sensitivity to it.
No, I like that. And that kind of goes into the next point I wanted to bring up. And I think this comes from potential tenants who go actually tour a building and they talk to leasing agents and they sometimes get this feedback. And I think it flows nicely. And that is leasing agents just want you to get into any unit. We wanted you on this podcast for this reason, because who knows better than that.
For this hot take specifically.
Pushing units, you know?
And we can't speak for all leasing agents or people I've talked to, but that's definitely, it ties into what you said now, even just leasing terms, you guys try to work with that. So maybe to speak a little bit on that.
I think you could get a third party person who maybe doesn't work for the owner, the operator, and they just want to collect their commission check at the end of the day. And it's no secret that leasing agents do have a commission or bonus potential for sure. When you work for the company that you're representing, it is not in your best interest to plug somebody into a unit that doesn't suit their needs, doesn't fit them. You don't think that they're going to have success there. You're going to see that person every single day when you go to work.
That's a good point.
It's not like a real estate agent where you're touring them through, you know, maybe 4 or 5 condo units. They sign a lease and that's it. You don't hear from them again. Our offices are intentionally designed to be inviting. Glass front doors. You see the leasing agents or leasing associates in the office when you come down to leave every day and on your way home from work. If there's a problem, they're going to hear about it, and they're going to hear about it for the duration of their lease.
Yeah.
So
I didn't know, like, see,
I think it's
before I started renting, I didn't know that. I thought you see a leasing agent, then when you sign, they're gone. But I think that comes part of the education process. It's like you want a good tenant just as much as they want a good unit, right? Because it's kind of an ongoing relationship, it sounds like.
exactly. And again, because it's a non-rent controlled building, 12 months down the line or 10 months down the line, you're going to start to have those renewal discussions as well. And so it's not just a one and done deal and you never hear from that person again. It's constant. And just the overall sense of community in our buildings between residents themselves, but between the staff and the residents is huge. And so, yeah, don't agree with that one.
Yeah. It kind of upsets the entire, just like the feeling and the vibe of the building.
Throws off the ecosystem that you're trying to create.
Yeah. I think like almost like any, non-rent controlled building, like any product service, like you don't want to sell something to somebody who doesn't want it or isn't a fit for it. Ends up costing you more than what you actually
100%.
got coming in. Turnover is expensive. Like if that person leaves in 12 months, I don't know if it pencils correctly that it would be better to have sold them that unit than not, because you're talking about, having to fix up the unit, repaint it a lot of the time. You're talking about having to remarket that unit, which is expensive. So these things cost money. And then at the end of the day, like, they upset the vibe. They take up more time, obviously, from the staff, maintenance, like whatever it is.
Yeah, you guys touched on it, and maybe some of our listeners don't know because it seems counterintuitive to what we said, but there's no rent control in some of these Toronto buildings. Or do some have it? Maybe just educate our listeners a little bit on, how does a Fitzrovia property have no rent control if it's new, right? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, so any building that took occupancy after November 2018 is not rent controlled. Anything prior is rent controlled. And so for any of our newer assets, which have all opened past that date, there is no rent control involved there. Again, people are asking about it. They want that long-term security. And so there are instances where for certain assets, certain times of the year, we'll do a longer term lease and kind of guarantee what that rent increase will be.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
And then for any of our assets that we have acquired in the last 15, 16 months, those were all built before and took occupancy well before that date. So those therefore are rent controlled. And so you have, as of this year, the 2.5% increase.
But that's part of the leasing process, is filling them in on this, right? It's like, hey, in case you don't, like, they should never be surprised that, 13 months they get notification, right? It's part of it, right?
100%. There's a huge educational component to it on both sides.
I would actually say, and I know you're mainly operating these lease ups in the GTA, but like we've seen since, I don't know, maybe the last 5-6 years, that you're probably more likely as a tenant in a non-rent controlled building to not receive a rent increase than you are if you are in a rent controlled building. So in a rent controlled building, you get a guideline increase as a landlord from the province every year. And it's been like 2% or in and around 2% for quite a number of years, despite obviously inflation at times, going all the way up to 8.5%, 9%. And so small landlords or any landlord who's operating a rent controlled building, they actually look at that 2% and it's a use it or lose it. So if you don't increase the rent by 2%, you never get that chance again, ultimately.
Oh, okay.
So you need to go and do it. It's almost like you have to do it. And it's like, here's your government sanctioned rent control, Mr. Tenant. It's not even on me. Sorry, the government gave me this, but I have to do it. Otherwise I lose that. And I can't come back to you next year and say 4% or whatnot. So from that standpoint, it's just like automatic. Every landlord does it for the most part. In a non-rent controlled environment, and I'm not saying the city of Toronto, because again, the city of Toronto has been hot. Mainly there's been increases, right? But we've seen markets, wax and wane through the years where sometimes there's actually been like rent decreases or renters negotiate for better rates. And it's not so automatic. You're not showing up with that rent control form and saying, here it is. Like it's back to just market value. What's going to happen? And the following year it could be 5-6%. I don't know if you've seen anything like that in your time, but
not as much no increase or a decrease, but you do hear stories of people that I work with, because we talk about all of their rent problems or non-problems all of the time, where oh yeah, my landlord doesn't live here. They just kind of forgot I was up for renewal.
Right.
And so my rent didn't increase this year. Versus I think the thought process is when you're told you have 2.5%, it's the click of a button. I'm just going to increase your rent 2.5%, versus when you're not reminded about it. For that, again, independent landlord, maybe they forgot. Maybe their costs remain the same and they can't be bothered. So you'll hear those like one-off instances for sure.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I think, especially for Fitzrovia, like your buildings are so unique and they each offer something slightly different, but the same level of quality that, like someone for you example, if I wanted to tour a building and maybe I mentioned that I was interested in something else, you have the ability to say, well, we actually maybe have a better spot at this building opening up. Right? There's a little bit more interaction and that comes with getting a really good leasing associate, is that, if they work for the company, they know the buildings and they try to align you properly. And I think that goes into the whole renting is a waste of money. Well, no, because you're effectively getting like the best sort of concierge service to find you the perfect home, right? It's a lot more involved, I think people don't understand with renting.
For sure. And it happens often. So I'll go back to Waverly as an example where our vacancy is slim to none. We'll have people that come in, maybe they're looking for a studio and we don't have one available. Instead of trying to jam them into a 1-bed, which is above their budget and they're not going to be happy with that year over year, we'll refer them to another property. So that leasing associate effectively lost their commission or their ability to do a deal here, but for the greater good of that resident and for the greater good of the buildings, refer them to an associate, up the street at another building that does have studio availability. And our leasing associates are talking to each other all the time. We have a new development that's opening in a couple of weeks, and we've had residents that have come from our existing 2 assets and sign leases there. And so we're keeping them within the Fitzrovia family. It's a good news story for us.
Well, unbelievably, we have made it to our final hot take. And I think this was the first one we got, and the reason why we really wanted Jenna on, because I think it goes nicely to everything she's talked about and you've talked about. And I think it's good for international people who are coming to Canada that they might feel this way really strongly, but renters have no community involvement. That is something that people say, and I think it makes sense. And I think maybe older people would agree with too about, the downside of renting. You're not even part of the community, you just live in a box in the sky. It kind of all ties together. So what do you think about that? Is there community involvement involved in renting, or is it mostly kind of maintained in your space?
I think we know my thoughts on this one. Huge sense of community. We are doing a ton of resident events on a weekly basis, sometimes multiple events a week. I'll use June as an example. It's Pride Month. We're throwing a huge Pride pool party at our assets. We're also doing a big Pride pool party at a future site just in the village. It's currently a parking lot. And so we throw a massive party there, invite all of our residents to come. But we're constantly hosting things, whether it's for various types of holidays, sporting events, you name it, we're doing it. And one of the most rewarding parts, I think, that our on-site teams will share is just that sense of community that we're bringing to the building. And so a lot of international residents, they might not know anyone here. They might not have family here. We've heard it time and time again that their neighbors and the staff are friendly faces and have become kind of their Toronto family. Community is like a huge sense of what we do. That'll never go away. We're constantly implementing it in assets that we're acquiring as well. Just really trying to shift that mentality that there is community. You don't just live in 500 square feet. Right. You have all of the amenity space. You see residents hanging out in the lobby, upstairs on the rooftop deck. It's amazing to see. And
I think that's important too, because you mentioned as well, like all the interprovincial migration, right? And maybe that is something where maybe I'm hesitant to move somewhere out of the province, but the rent's so much more affordable, but it's a new place. But if you kind of open your mindset a little bit, saying, hey, we're actually going to guide you through it and we're going to bring you into a community where it might be a little bit easier to do so. Maybe that will encourage people to take that move a little bit more seriously.
It also creates a bit more stickiness in the community. So we're talking a lot about rent control and renewals, non-rent controlled asset. When you love the people that you live next door to and you really value that sense of community, you feel like you belong and have that sense of belonging, the probability of you going out and looking for another apartment or another purpose-built rental decreases. So you just, I mean, it's amazing to see the number of people that stay, and then their kind of group of friends are all staying and their neighbors are staying, and seeing them renewing year over year.
I think we've seen it in other kind of forward-thinking businesses in other industries, and you guys have done this amazing job of like creating a destination from your communities, from your properties, where that's actually a huge part of the value prop. And I don't think like you throw a price tag on that necessarily, but it's more there on the like retention side of it. And it probably comes out to, make it a better investment at the end of the day, but it's better for everyone, right? It's just like that natural flow of B2C. You see it in these other industries like, F45, in the fitness industry or whatnot, like they've done that too. Like they're all about creating like a community between, their trainers and the people who go and the people who go and the other people who go. And like, that's just a huge part of it. You don't want to like leave your friends or your family or, like
stuff. Yeah.
It's the same way I feel about like my neighbors. If I ever moved, I'd be like, I would miss my neighbors, you know? So I think like that's a huge part of it, what you guys are doing.
You also have people not going into an office 5 days a week. They're not getting that same social interaction that they were pre-COVID. Maybe they are 100% remote. Maybe they're going in 1 to 2 days and seeing 20% of their office. And so taking their laptop, going and working out of the common areas, they're not working with their neighbors, but they're side by side and they don't feel like they've had no social interaction for the day is another really big thing. People have shifted the way they work. And so working out of their homes, they want to feel like they've had some sort of social engagement.
I would think so, right? Like that's, so many downsides, but the whole working from home every day during COVID was just, you're getting the work done. It was such an isolating feeling that even just being in a room with other people, I think would be kind of enough to get you out of your apartment, right? Like we know just in our offices, just how much better it is when everyone's kind of together, and that's just work. So if you're thinking of your community where you live, there's so many more benefits and actually gives you some pride in where you live. I think that's the important thing as well. When tenants actually care about where they are, they invest in you and you invest in them, right? I think that's the relationship we're looking for. As you said, there's sometimes a divide between tenants and landlords, right?
There's all sorts of divides. Another divide is like, okay, in a condo building, you have the divide between the owners who live in the condo building and the renters who live in the condo building. And like the owners sit on the condo board, or a portion of them sit on the condo board, and the renters have no control and they all hate each other. And like, we've all heard these stories, right? But in the really nice thing about these like nice purpose-built rentals that are popping up all over the country is that there's that level playing field. Everyone who lives in the building has that sort of like-mindedness, has that same sort of vision for lifestyle and community. And I think that's really nice. You don't want to like over homogenize, but like within the building, that's really nice to have. Obviously within the neighborhood, you want a huge mix of owners, renters, right? And we have that in Toronto, no doubt.
Definitely.
But I think that's just like another divide that like you can kind of squash potentially.
Well, whether you're renting or leasing small landlords, I'm sure that people will have more questions, or maybe they want to know more about properties at Fitzrovia. Where can guys reach you guys if they're interested? I know we're pretty friendly here, so if someone wants to reach out and ask some questions or get in touch, what's the best way to do so?
By email. So jchick@fitzrovia.ca. Also take a look at Fitzrovia.ca. We've linked all of our different properties, both in Toronto and Montreal there. There's direct links to be able to book a tour, speak to someone in leasing, view floor plans, pricing, amenities, all that good stuff.
Awesome.
Do it. Those buildings are incredible. And you can reach me on LinkedIn. I'm always on there ranting about something. So that's...
and I'm there commenting. No. Well, thanks guys. This was great. I think we really gave a lot of valuable resources to people who maybe don't know as much of the rental market as they should. And I think this will be great. And then hopefully we'll have you on again to talk about what's to come for Fitzrovia, because I know you guys are always planning something next, as something's coming in the next few weeks, I hear. Yeah. So...
always growing.
I want to go to the party, the Pride party.
Oh, I thought this was the invite. I thought this was the...
Yeah, did we get the invite?
Was this? I thought this was
it. Pride party. See you guys there, yeah.
It's on record now.
Love to have you.
Well, thanks you both, and thanks for everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Sink or Swim, brought to you by Rentsync. If you enjoyed today's show, make sure to visit www.rentsync.com/podcasts for detailed show notes, key takeaways, and more. Thanks for listening.